Welcome to World of Sleepcraft. Tonight we journey through the life of Thrall, the orc who rose from slavery to become Warchief of the Horde, and whose destiny would reshape the fate of two worlds. His is a tale of chains broken and spirits awakened, of a people redeemed through the courage of one who refused to accept the darkness imposed upon him. His story spans decades of conflict and reconciliation, of leadership gained and leadership surrendered, of a shaman's path that would lead him from the fighting pits of Durnholde Keep to the councils that guide nations. Settle in, get comfortable, close your eyes, and let this epic tale of redemption unfold before you as you drift toward peaceful slumber. Few figures in the history of Azeroth have had such a profound impact on the course of events as the orc known as Thrall. Born Goel, son of Durotan and Draka, he was destined from his first breath to walk a path unlike any other. His story begins not in triumph, but in tragedy, not in power, but in powerlessness. For Thrall entered the world at the very moment when his people stood on the precipice of their greatest defeat. To understand Thrall, one must first understand the world into which he was born. The orcs of Draenor had been a noble people once, shamanistic tribes who lived in harmony with the elements and honored the spirits of their ancestors. They had lived in great clans that roamed the plains and forests of their homeworld, following the herds and the seasons, guided by shamans who spoke with the spirits of earth and fire, water and air. But that world had been corrupted by the machinations of the Burning Legion, by the warlock Gul'dan and his Shadow Council, who had led the orcish race into demonic servitude. The demon lord Kil'jaeden had seen in the orcs a weapon to be forged, a people to be twisted to serve the Legion's endless conquest. Through Gul'dan, he offered the orcs power beyond anything they had known, and in their pride and their hunger, they accepted. The orcs had drunk the blood of Manaroth, had turned their skin green with fell corruption, had been transformed from a proud warrior culture into an army of destruction. The change was not just physical, but spiritual. The connection to the elements that had defined Orcish society for millennia was severed in an instant, replaced by a bond to demonic masters who cared nothing for Orcish lives or traditions. They had invaded Azeroth through the Dark Portal, had waged two devastating wars against the humans and their allies, and had ultimately been defeated. The first war saw the destruction of Stormwind, the burning of a human kingdom by a force that the people of Azeroth had never imagined. The second war was larger and bloodier, drawing in dwarves and elves, spreading destruction across the eastern kingdoms before the Horde was finally broken. By the time of Thrall's birth, the Horde lay broken and scattered. The once mighty orcish armies had been reduced to prisoners, herded into internment camps across the eastern kingdoms, where they languished in a strange lethargy that seemed to have consumed their very spirits. The warriors who had conquered a kingdom now sat staring at nothing, unable to summon the will to even stand. The orcs were dying, not from wounds or disease, but from something deeper, a spiritual malaise that their human captors did not understand. But there were those who had never drunk the demon blood, who had resisted Gul'dan's corruption and maintained their connection to the old ways. Among these was the Frostwolf clan, led by Chieftain Durotan and his mate Draka. They had been exiled from the Horde for their refusal to embrace the demonic path, forced to make their home in the harsh mountains of Alterac, far from their corrupted brethren. It was here, in these frozen peaks, that Goel was born in the first year after the opening of the Dark Portal. His parents had defied Gul'dan, and the Shadow Council had maintained their honor when so many others had lost theirs. They looked upon their newborn son with hope, believing that he represented the future of their people, a generation that might one day reclaim what had been lost. But the Shadow Council had long memories and longer reach. Gul'dan could not allow Durotan's defiance to go unpunished, could not permit the existence of orcs who might remind others of what they had once been. He dispatched assassins to find the Frostwolf chieftain and his family to eliminate the threat they posed to his control over the Horde. The assassins found Durotan and Draka in the wilderness, traveling with their infant son. What followed was a battle that demonstrated everything the Frostwolves had always been, warriors of honor who fought to the last breath. Durotan fell defending his mate and child, his last thoughts not of his own survival, but of the tiny life he was trying to protect. Even as the assassin's blades found their marks, he fought on, buying precious moments for Draka to hide their son. Draka, even mortally wounded, fought on with a ferocity that took the assassins by surprise. She was no stranger to battle, had earned her place as the chieftain's mate through deeds of valor that matched any warrior's. The blood that poured from her wounds did not slow her strikes. She killed several of the assassins, her axe finding their throats and hearts, even as her own life drained away. When she finally fell, it was not from surrender, but from the simple failure of a body that could no longer sustain itself. In her final moments, Draka's thoughts were of her son. She had hidden him in the brush nearby, had placed him where the assassins might overlook him, had prayed to whatever spirits might still listen that he would survive. The name she and Durotan had chosen echoed in her fading consciousness. Goel, the Redeemer. Let him live, she thought. Let him live to redeem what we have lost. The assassins, satisfied that their primary targets were dead, did not conduct a thorough search. They assumed the child would die in the wilderness, claimed by the cold or by predators. An infant alone in the Alterac Mountains had no chance of survival, or so they believed. They did not understand that destiny had other plans for the son of Durotan. The cold of Alterac should have killed the infant. The wolves and bears that roamed the mountains should have found him. Starvation should have claimed him before rescue could arrive. But against all odds, the child survived through the night, his cries drawing attention that would shape the rest of his life. They were wrong about his death. They could not have been more wrong. The one who found the orphaned infant was not a friend, but an opportunist. Aedelas Blackmoore was a human military commander who oversaw the internment camps where captured orcs were held. He was a man of considerable ambition and few scruples, a drunkard and a schemer who saw in every situation an opportunity for personal advancement. When Blackmoore discovered the orcish infant among the bodies of his slain parents, he did not kill the child as many humans would have done. Instead, he saw potential. Here was an orc that could be raised from birth, trained and conditioned to serve human interests. Here was a weapon that might one day be turned against its own kind, or used to control them. Blackmoore named the infant Thrall, a word that means slave. It was a deliberate choice, a constant reminder of the child's place in the world. The orc would never be allowed to forget that he was property, that his very existence was at the sufferance of his human masters. The young thrall was taken to Durnholde Keep, the fortress from which Blackmoore administered his domain of internment camps. There he was raised in conditions that were luxurious compared to the other imprisoned orcs, but that were still fundamentally those of captivity. He was given education, training, and even a degree of comfort, but he was never given freedom. Blackmoore's plan was multifaceted and cunning. He would raise Thrall to be a perfect gladiator, a warrior of unmatched skill who could win fortune and fame in the fighting pits. At the same time, he would educate the orc in strategy and tactics, in history and politics, creating a creature that combined orcish strength with human knowledge. Eventually, when the time was right, Blackmoore intended to use Thrall to unite the imprisoned orcs under his command, creating an army that would march on Lord Aeron and place Blackmoore himself on the throne. From his earliest years, Thrall was trained in combat. Human weapon masters taught him to wield every manner of sword and axe, mace and spear. He learned to fight with shield and without, to grapple and strike, to use his natural orcish strength to devastating effect. By the time he was an adolescent, Thrall was already a formidable warrior, capable of defeating opponents, twice his age and experience. But even as Blackmoore shaped Thrall into a weapon, others were shaping him into something more. Taretha Foxton was a young human woman who served in Blackmoore's household, the daughter of servants who had known Thrall since his earliest days. Where others saw a monster or a tool, Taretha saw a person. She befriended the young orc, speaking with him when others would not, treating him with a kindness that was foreign to his experience. Their friendship was secret and forbidden. Blackmoore would not have approved of any relationship that might give Thrall ideas above his station. But Taretha found ways to communicate with Thrall, passing him notes and small gifts, teaching him that not all humans viewed him with contempt or fear. From Taretha, Thrall learned about mercy and compassion. He learned that the world was larger than the walls of Durnholde Keep, that there were people in it who were neither masters nor slaves. She told him stories of the world outside, of kingdoms and cities, of forests and mountains, of a life that might exist beyond the fighting pits and the chains. There was another who influenced Thrall during these years, though in a very different way. His combat instructor was a man named Sergeant, who, despite his role in preparing Thrall for the gladiatorial arena, found himself developing a grudging respect for his student. The sergeant taught Thrall about honor in combat, about the warrior's code that existed even among humans. He instilled in Thrall principles that Blackmoore never intended him to have, the understanding that strength should be used to protect, not merely to dominate. The gladiatorial fights that Blackmoore forced Thrall to participate in were brutal affairs, spectacles of violence designed to entertain crowds and fill Blackmoore's coffers. Thrall fought against other prisoners, against captured beasts, against anyone Blackmoore could find to throw into the ring. He won every fight, not just because of his training, but because some part of him refused to surrender, refused to let his spirit be broken, even as his body was forced into servitude. The arena at Durnholde Keep was a pit of sand and blood, surrounded by stands where humans gathered to watch the spectacle. They came from miles around, these crowds, eager to see the green-skinned monster tear apart whatever opponent Blackmoore had found for him. They cheered when Thrall was victorious, screamed when his opponents landed blows, threw coins and garbage into the pit with equal enthusiasm. Thrall learned to ignore the crowds. He learned to focus only on the opponent in front of him, to read their movements and anticipate their attacks. He learned to kill quickly when killing was necessary, to disable when survival did not require death. The fighting became routine, a rhythm of violence that punctuated the monotony of his captivity. Some of his opponents were orcs from the internment camps, prisoners who had volunteered for the arena in hope of winning their freedom. These fights were the hardest for Thrall. He was killing his own kind, orcs who might have been his neighbors on Draenor, who might have known his parents, who might have been anything but enemies in a different world. He tried to make their deaths quick and clean, to offer them what dignity he could in their final moments. Other opponents were beasts captured from the wild, wolves and bears, boars and creatures that had no names in common. These fights were often the most dangerous, as animals did not tire or surrender, did not follow predictable patterns of combat. Thrall bore scars from these encounters, marks on his flesh that reminded him of how close he had come to death on multiple occasions. The humans who watched these fights saw only a monster doing what monsters did. They did not understand that Thrall felt every death, that he lay awake in his cell after the crowds departed thinking about the lives he had taken. They did not know that he prayed to gods he had never been taught about, asking for forgiveness he was not sure he deserved. But with each victory, Thrall felt the emptiness of his existence more keenly. He fought, he won, he returned to his cell. He fought again, won again, returned again. There was no meaning in it, no purpose beyond survival. He looked at the other orcs in the internment camps and saw beings who had given up entirely, who sat listless and despairing as if the very life had been drained from them. Thrall did not know then that this lethargy was a consequence of the breaking of their demonic bond. When the orcs had drunk Manaroth's blood, they had been connected to a source of power that drove their aggression and fury. When that connection was severed after the Second War, they were left hollow, bereft of the demonic energy that had sustained them. Without it, they had no will to fight, no will to live, no will to do anything but wait for death. Thrall was different because he had never drunk the demon blood. He had never been connected to Manaroth, had never experienced the false power that the corruption provided. His strength came from within, from a spirit that had never been tainted by demonic influence. But he did not understand this yet. He only knew that he was not like the others, and he did not know why. Years passed in this manner. Thrall grew to adulthood in captivity, his body becoming more powerful even as his soul yearned for something he could not name. Taretha continued to be his only true friend, the only person in his world who treated him as more than a weapon or a source of entertainment. Their friendship deepened into something that transcended the barriers between their species, a bond that would prove crucial in the events to come. The escape, when it came, was not a sudden decision, but the culmination of years of growing awareness. Thrall had heard whispers of orcs who lived free, who had never been captured by the humans, who maintained their old ways somewhere in the wilderness. These rumors kindled a fire in him that could not be extinguished. If there were free orcs, then perhaps there was hope. Perhaps there was a life beyond the walls of Durnholde Keep. The whispers came from many sources. Guards who talked among themselves without realizing that Thrall could understand their language. Traders who passed through Durnholde and mentioned strange sightings in the wilderness. Even other prisoners who had heard tales before their capture. The stories were fragmentary and often contradictory, but they all pointed to the same conclusion. Not all orcs had surrendered, not all had been captured, not all had given up. The name that appeared most often in these whispers was Grom Hellscream. Even humans who had never faced him in battle spoke his name with fear and respect. His battle cry, they said, could be heard across entire battlefields, a sound that drove his enemies to flee and his allies to heights of courage. He led a group called the Warsong Clan, and they had never stopped fighting. Thrall became obsessed with finding these free orcs. Every night, as he lay in his cell recovering from whatever beating or battle the day had brought, he dreamed of the wilderness where orcs still lived according to their own ways. Every day, he gathered whatever information he could, building a mental map of the lands beyond Durnholde Keep and the routes that might take him to freedom. Taretha helped him escape. She risked everything, her position, her safety, her very life, to give Thrall a chance at freedom. Her reasons were complex. She cared for him as a friend, perhaps the only true friend either of them had. She believed that what Blackmoore was doing was wrong, that raising a sentient being as a weapon and a slave was a moral obscenity, and she had come to believe that Thrall was destined for something greater, that his life had meaning beyond the gladiatorial arena. She provided him with information about the world outside, with supplies for his journey, with the means to slip past the guards who watched him constantly. She drew him maps from memory, based on conversations she had overheard and books she had read. She stole food and water skins from the kitchen, hiding them in places where Thrall could retrieve them without being noticed. She identified the guard rotations and found the gaps through which he might slip. When Thrall asked her why she would take such risks for him, she told him that she believed he was meant for something greater than the fighting pits, that his destiny lay beyond the walls that had contained him all his life. She did not know what that destiny was, only that it existed, and that she would do everything in her power to give him the chance to fulfill it. The night of his escape was a blur of shadows and fear. Thrall moved through the darkness of Durnholde Keep, avoiding patrols, climbing walls that should have been impassable, driven by a desperation that gave him strength beyond his already considerable power. Behind him, he left the only life he had ever known. Ahead of him lay a world he had only heard about in stories. His first days of freedom were among the hardest of his life. Thrall knew nothing of survival in the wild, had never needed to find food or shelter on his own, had never been without the structure of captivity to define his days. He wandered through forests and across plains, hunted by Blackmoore's soldiers who had been sent to recapture this valuable property, pursued by a past that refused to let him go. But Thrall was resourceful, and he was determined. He learned to hunt, to build fires, to read the land as his ancestors had done for countless generations before the corruption came. Each day he survived was a victory. Each night he slept free was a triumph over everything Blackmoore had tried to make him. His search led him to the Warsong clan, one of the few orcish groups that had escaped the internment camps and maintained their freedom through constant fighting and movement. The Warsong were led by Gromish Hellscream, a legendary warrior whose battle cry was said to freeze the hearts of his enemies. Grom was everything Thrall was not, a true orc raised in the old traditions, a veteran of both wars against the humans, a chieftain who had led his people through impossible odds. Their meeting was not friendly at first. Grom saw in Thrall an orc who had been raised by humans, who spoke their language and had adopted their mannerisms. He suspected treachery, wondered if this strange warrior was a spy sent by the internment camp commanders to infiltrate and destroy the Warsong. But as they spoke, as Thrall demonstrated his strength and his hunger to learn, Grom began to see something else. Thrall spent many seasons with the Warsong, learning from Grom and his warriors. He learned the Orcish language properly, learned the history of his people, learned the traditions and customs that had been kept from him all his life. Grom told him of the glory days before the corruption, of shamans who had communed with the elements, and ancestors who had guided their descendants from beyond death. He also told him of the fall, of Gul'dan and the demon blood, of the terrible price the orcs had paid for their moment of power. It was Grom who revealed to Thrall that he was of the Frostwolf clan, the exiled tribe that had refused the demon blood and paid for their defiance with isolation and death. Thrall learned that his father had been Durotan, a chieftain of great honor and wisdom, and that his mother Draka had been a warrior of legendary ferocity. He learned that he was born Goel, a name that meant redeemer in the Orcish tongue, and that his parents had believed he would one day lead their people out of darkness. The knowledge was overwhelming. Thrall had spent his entire life believing he was nothing, a nameless slave with no history and no heritage. Now he learned that he was the son of chieftains, the heir to a proud tradition that stretched back generations. He learned that his parents had died defending him, had sacrificed everything so that he might have a chance to live and perhaps fulfill the destiny they had dreamed for him. Grom told Thrall that the Frostwolves still existed, hidden away in the mountains of Alterac, where they had made their home in exile. If Thrall wished to understand who he truly was, if he wished to claim his birthright and learn the ways that had been denied him, he would need to find them. The journey to the Frostwolf village was a pilgrimage in every sense of the word. Thrall traveled through lands haunted by the memories of 2 wars, past ruined villages and abandoned fortresses, through territories still patrolled by human soldiers who would have killed him on sight. He moved carefully, using the skills he had learned from Grom and the Warsong, becoming one with the wilderness in a way that his time at Durnholde Keep had never prepared him for. The Frostwolves had built their home in a hidden valley high in the Alterac Mountains, a place accessible only to those who knew the secret paths through the peaks. When Thrall finally found them, he was met with suspicion. These orcs had survived by remaining hidden, by trusting no one outside their clan. A stranger approaching their territory, even one who claimed to be the son of their murdered chieftain, could be a threat. But among the Frostwolves was one who remembered. Drekthar was an elderly shaman, blind from wounds suffered long ago, but possessed of spiritual sight that penetrated far deeper than physical vision. He had been Durotan's advisor, had known Draka since she was a young warrior, had been present at Goel's birth before the assassination that had torn the family apart. Drekthar examined Thrall with the senses that remained to him. He touched the young orc's face, felt the contours of his features, reached out with his shamanic perception to examine the spirit that dwelt within the body. And when he was finished, the old shaman wept. The son of Durotan had returned, had survived against all odds, had found his way home after years of captivity among the humans. The Frostwolves accepted Thrall as one of their own, but acceptance was only the beginning. Thrall had come seeking not just belonging, but understanding. He had heard Grom speak of the old ways, of the shamans who had once been the spiritual heart of Orcish society. He wanted to learn these ways, to understand the power that the warlocks had perverted, and the connection that the demon blood had severed. Drekthar became Thrall's teacher, just as he had once taught Durotan. The old shaman explained that shamanism was not about commanding the elements, but about communing with them, about forming relationships of mutual respect with the spirits of earth, air, fire, and water. It was not power that was taken, but power that was given, not domination, but partnership. The training was unlike anything Thrall had experienced. At Durnholde Keep, learning had been about memorizing facts and mastering techniques. Shamanism required something different entirely. It required opening the soul to forces beyond mortal understanding, becoming vulnerable in ways that a gladiator could never afford to be. Thrall struggled at first. Years of captivity had taught him to guard himself, to trust no one, to keep his true self hidden behind walls of stoicism and violence. These walls were not easily dismantled. The elements sensed his resistance, his fear, his anger at everything that had been done to him. They did not reject him, but neither did they fully embrace him. Drekthar guided him through meditation and ritual, through long nights of communion with the spirits, and longer days of physical trials that tested the limits of his endurance. Slowly, painfully, Thrall learned to let go of the rage that had sustained him through the fighting pits, to release the bitterness that had accumulated through years of humiliation and abuse. The breakthrough came during a spirit walk, a shamanic journey into the realm where the elements dwelled. Thrall found himself in a place beyond physical reality, surrounded by presences that were vast and ancient and utterly inhuman. They examined him, these spirits of nature and power, and they found in him something they had not found in any orc since the corruption began. Thrall was clean. His spirit had never been tainted by demon blood, had never been corrupted by the fell energies that had consumed his people. He was what the orcs had been before Gul'dan and the Shadow Council, before Manaroth and the Burning Legion. He was a reminder of what had been lost and a promise of what might be regained. The elements accepted him. Earth lent him its strength and stability. Water gave him its adaptability and flow. Air granted him its freedom and swiftness. Fire blessed him with its passion and purifying heat. Even the spirits of the wilds, of life itself, acknowledged the young orc as one who walked in harmony with the world. When Thrall emerged from his spirit walk, he was no longer the same being who had entered. He had become a shaman, the first new shaman to be accepted by the elements since Gul'dan's corruption had severed the connection between the orcs and the spirits. The symbolic significance was immense. If the elements had forgiven one orc, perhaps they could forgive others. If one had reconnected with the old ways, perhaps the entire race might one day do the same. Drekthar saw in his student the fulfillment of Durotan's hope. Goel, the Redeemer, had returned to his people and been touched by the spirits themselves. Perhaps this was the beginning of something new, or rather the restoration of something ancient that should never have been lost. Word of Thrall's return and his shamanic awakening spread beyond the Frostwolf village. The orcs who had escaped the internment camps, who lived as fugitives and raiders in the wilderness, heard stories of a new shaman who had emerged from the mountains. Some came to see for themselves, drawn by curiosity or hope, or simply the desire to witness something that should have been impossible. Among those who took interest was Orgrim Doomhammer, the former Warchief of the Horde who had led the orcs during the Second War. Doomhammer was a legendary figure, a warrior of immense power who had wielded the artifact hammer that bore his name. He had overthrown the puppets of the Shadow Council, had tried to lead the Horde to victory through strength and honor rather than demonic corruption. He had failed, but he had never stopped fighting. Doomhammer had escaped the internment camps years earlier and had been living in hiding, watching and waiting for an opportunity to free his people. When he heard about Thrall, about this son of Durotan who had been raised by humans but had found his way back to the old traditions, he was intrigued. He traveled to the Frostwolf village to meet this young orc and judge for himself whether the stories were true. Their first encounter was a test. Doomhammer challenged Thrall to single combat, wanting to see whether the gladiator training and shamanic power amounted to anything when facing a true orcish warrior. The fight was fierce, perhaps the most challenging Thrall had ever experienced. Doomhammer was older, yes, but his experience and skill more than compensated for any disadvantage of age. But Thrall held his own. He drew upon everything he had learned, from the combat techniques of Durnholde Keep, to the tactical wisdom of the war song, to the spiritual strength granted by his shamanic connection. He could not defeat Doomhammer, but neither could the former Warchief defeat him. The fight ended in mutual respect, with both warriors acknowledging the other's prowess. Doomhammer told Thrall of his plans to liberate the orcs from the internment camps. For years he had been gathering information, identifying weaknesses in the human defenses, building a network of contacts who could help when the time came. What he had lacked was someone to inspire the imprisoned orcs, to reawaken the spirits that had been crushed by defeat and captivity. In Thrall, he believed he had found that someone. This young shaman, this son of the defiant Durotan, this orc who had risen from slavery to claim his heritage, could be the symbol around which the Horde might rally. Doomhammer offered to make Thrall his second in command, to work together to free their people and rebuild what had been lost. Thrall accepted, but he made clear that the new Horde they built would not be like the old one. There would be no demon blood, no warlocks, no corruption. They would return to the ways of their ancestors, to shamanism and honor and strength that came from within rather than from external sources of dark power. The liberation of the internment camps began with careful raids, striking at weak points and freeing small groups of orcs at a time. Thrall and Doomhammer led these attacks personally, demonstrating to the prisoners that there was still fight left in the orcish race, that freedom was possible for those willing to grasp it. The camps themselves were scattered across the eastern kingdoms, each one a small prison holding hundreds of orcs in conditions that varied from harsh to unbearable. Some camps were run by commanders who saw their prisoners as barely better than animals, who provided minimal food and shelter and cared nothing for the suffering of those in their charge. Others were run by more practical administrators who understood that dead prisoners were useless, but who still viewed the orcs with contempt and fear. Thrall and Doomhammer studied each camp before attacking, identifying guard rotations and defensive weaknesses, learning which prisoners might be ready to fight and which were too broken to be counted upon. The planning was meticulous because failure meant more than just tactical defeat. Every failed raid would strengthen human vigilance, would make future attacks harder, would crush the hope of prisoners who had briefly dared to dream of freedom. At first, the freed orcs were hesitant. They had been broken by years of captivity, had forgotten what it meant to be warriors, had lost the will that had once made them feared throughout two worlds. The lethargy that had consumed them was spiritual as much as physical, a consequence of the severed demonic bond that had left them hollow and purposeless. Many simply sat and stared when their cages were opened, unable to comprehend that freedom was being offered to them. But Thrall spoke to them of their heritage, of the old ways, of the elements that still waited to welcome them back. His shamanic presence reminded them of what they had been before the corruption, and slowly, painfully, they began to remember. He called upon the spirits in their presence, demonstrated that the connection the warlocks had destroyed could be restored. He showed them that there was another source of power available to the orcs, one that did not require demonic slavery. The spiritual awakening was gradual but real. Orcs who had not felt anything but despair for years began to stir when Thrall called the elements. They watched as earth and fire responded to his command, as wind and water bent to his will. And they remembered that once, long ago, their own shamans had wielded such powers that the orcs had been a spiritually connected people before Gul'dan led them astray. Not all the raids went smoothly. Some were discovered before they could be completed, leading to fierce battles with human guards. The humans were well armed and motivated, fighting to contain what they saw as a dangerous uprising of savage prisoners. Orcish blood flowed freely in these confrontations, and not all of it belonged to the liberators. Some orcs refused to leave, too damaged by their experiences to believe that anything better was possible. They had learned helplessness so thoroughly that freedom itself seemed like a trap. And some fell during the escape attempts, their freedom purchased with their lives. Thrall remembered each orc who fell in these raids. He learned their names when he could, honored their sacrifice in the shamanic traditions that Drekthar had taught him. These were the martyrs of the new horde, the ones who gave everything so that others might be free. Their spirits would be remembered when the orcs built their new homeland, but the movement grew. Each successful liberation brought more orcs into the fold, and each new warrior spread word of what was happening to those still imprisoned. The humans began to realize that something was changing, that the listless prisoners they had thought broken were awakening to new purpose. Reinforcements were sent to the camps, guard rotations were increased, Interrogations were conducted to discover who was leading this resistance, but the orcs kept their silence, and the raids continued. The final assault came at Durnholde Keep itself, the fortress where Thrall had been raised, and where the largest concentration of imprisoned orcs was held. It was a bold attack, perhaps foolishly so, but Doomhammer believed that destroying the heart of the internment system would break human control over the remaining camps. If they could take Durnholde, the symbol of human dominance over the orcs, the psychological impact would be as significant as the military victory. The orcish army approached the fortress under cover of darkness, moving in small groups to avoid detection until the last possible moment. Thrall called upon the elements to mask their approach, summoning fog to shroud their movements and silencing the sounds of their march. It was shamanic warfare of a kind that had not been seen since before the corruption, the elements themselves fighting alongside the orcs against their oppressors. The battle was fierce. Thrall found himself fighting through the same corridors where he had been dragged as a child, past the same cells where he had spent his nights, toward the same arena where he had shed blood for Blackmoore's entertainment. Every step was a confrontation with his past, a reminder of everything that had been done to him and everything he had become since escaping. The human defenders fought with desperate courage. Many of them were soldiers who had served at Durnholde for years, who had watched over the prisoners and believed they were protecting their families from savage monsters. They did not understand that the orcs they fought were not the mindless destroyers of the First and Second Wars, but free beings seeking nothing more than liberation. In their minds, they were fighting to prevent another wave of destruction. The fighting was room by room, corridor by corridor. Orcish warriors fell to human swords, and human soldiers fell to orcish axes. The stones of Durnholde were stained with blood from both sides, the price of liberation measured in lives that would never see the freedom they fought for. Blackmoore awaited them in the heart of the keep. Thrall's former master was drunk, as he so often was, but the alcohol did nothing to diminish his cruelty. When he saw Thrall leading the attack, he flew into a rage. This slave, this property, had dared to rise against him, had dared to lead an army against the very walls that had contained him for so many years. Blackmoore ranted about his plans, about how Thrall had been meant to serve him, to lead an orcish army under his command, to place Blackmoore on the throne of Lordaeron. The years of careful manipulation, the education and training, the gladiatorial fights, all of it had been designed to create the perfect weapon, and now that weapon had turned against its creator. But the confrontation that Thrall expected did not come. Blackmoore was killed during the assault, brought down by his own sins and the consequences of years of abuse and arrogance. The exact circumstances varied in different tellings. Some said he fell to an orcish blade, others that his own soldiers turned against him when they saw the battle was lost. Thrall did not have the opportunity to face his former master in single combat, did not get the closure that part of him had craved. Perhaps it was better that way. Perhaps some victories were sweeter for being anti-climax. Perhaps the universe had decided that Blackmoore was not worthy of a warrior's death. The tragedy of the battle was not Blackmoore's death, but Doomhammer's. The former Warchief fell during the assault, struck down by a human soldier's spear as he fought to breach the inner defenses. The blow came from behind, from a defender he had not seen, and it struck true. The legendary warrior who had led the Horde through the Second War, who had overthrown the puppets of the Shadow Council and tried to restore Orcish honor, fell with a cry that echoed through the halls of Durnholde. Thrall reached him before the light faded from his eyes. Doomhammer lived long enough to know that the battle was won, that Durnholde Keep would fall, that the orcs would be free. The dream he had carried since his own escape from the internment camps was coming true, even if he would not live to see it fully realized. In his final moments, Orgrim Doomhammer named Thrall as his successor. He bequeathed to the young shaman his legendary armor and the mighty hammer that bore his name, symbols of authority that stretched back through generations of Orcish leadership. "You were raised by them," Doomhammer said, meaning the humans, "but you are one of us. Lead our people, young one. Lead them to glory." Thrall, son of Durotan, slave no longer, shaman of the restored spirits, was now Warchief of the Horde. The weight of that responsibility settled onto his shoulders, like the armor he now wore. He had not sought leadership, had not believed himself worthy of it, but destiny had placed him here, at this moment, with these choices. He would have to become the leader his people needed. Another tragedy accompanied the victory at Durnholde Keep. Taretha Foxton, the human woman who had been Thrall's only friend during his years of captivity, who had helped him escape and set him on the path to his destiny, had been discovered. Blackmoore, in his drunken fury, had executed her for her betrayal before Thrall could reach the keep. The discovery of Taretha's death came through the testimonies of surviving servants who had witnessed the execution. Blackmoore had paraded her through the halls of Durnholde, had denounced her as a traitor before everyone in the keep, had made an example of what happened to those who defied him. She had not begged for mercy, they said. She had faced her death with the same quiet courage that had defined her entire life. The news devastated Thrall in ways that few things had. He had survived the fighting pits, had endured years of captivity, had watched friends fall in battle. But Taretha's death struck differently. She had believed in him when no one else did, had seen a person where others saw only a monster, had sacrificed everything to give him a chance at freedom. And now she was gone, killed not by enemies in battle, but by the casual cruelty of a man who had never deserved the power he wielded. Thrall found the place where they had buried her, a shallow grave outside the walls of Durnholde that had been dug in haste and filled with contempt. He knelt beside it for a long time, speaking words that no one else could hear. He made promises to her memory, that he would never forget what she had done, that he would try to be worthy of her sacrifice, that he would work to build a world where such kindness could exist between their peoples. Then he rose, gathered himself, and returned to his duties as Warchief. There was no time for grief, not with so many depending on him, not with so much work still to be done. But he carried her memory with him always, a small piece of jewelry she had given him during their secret communications, worn next to his heart where no one could see. Taretha had represented everything good that he had experienced among humans, proof that not all of them were enemies, that kindness could cross the boundaries between species. Her death was a reminder of the cost of the conflict, of the innocent lives that were lost in the struggle between Horde and Alliance. It would have been easy to let that death turn him toward hatred, to see all humans as responsible for what Blackmoore had done. But that would have betrayed everything Taretha had believed in. She had seen past the differences between their peoples, had recognized the person beneath the green skin and the fangs. If Thrall allowed her death to poison his view of humanity, he would be proving that her faith in him had been misplaced. Thrall carried Taretha's memory with him as he led the Horde away from Durnholde Keep. He would never forget her sacrifice, never forget that his freedom had been purchased in part with her life, and he would never allow himself to hate all humans for the crimes of some, would always remember that there were those among them capable of compassion and courage. When he later formed his alliance with Jaina Proudmoore, some part of him was remembering Taretha, honoring her memory by proving that peace between orc and human was possible. The newly liberated Horde faced a choice. They could remain in the Eastern Kingdoms, continuing to fight against the humans who had imprisoned them, carving out territory through blood and violence. Or they could seek a new home, a place where they might build something fresh without the constant pressure of war. The answer came from an unexpected source. A mysterious prophet appeared before Thrall, cloaked in shadow and speaking in riddles, but carrying a message of undeniable urgency. This prophet, who would later be revealed as the Guardian Medivh, warned that a great evil was coming to Azeroth, that the Burning Legion was preparing to invade, and that only by leaving the Eastern Kingdoms could the orcs survive. The prophet's appearance was strange and unsettling. He seemed to flicker between forms, sometimes appearing as a raven, sometimes as a hooded figure, sometimes as something that defied easy description. His voice carried weight beyond its volume, resonating with power that suggested he was far more than a mere mortal messenger. And his warnings were specific enough to be convincing, filled with details that no ordinary prophet could have known. Thrall was skeptical at first. He had learned to trust the elements, to read the signs that nature provided, but this stranger was not speaking of natural forces. He spoke of demons and invasions, of apocalyptic events that seemed impossible to prevent. And he spoke of Kalimdor, a land that existed only in ancient stories, a continent that the orcs had never seen. But something about the prophet's warning resonated with Thrall's shamanic senses. The elements had been troubled lately, whispering of darkness gathering in the north, of corruption spreading through the land. The spirits seemed to confirm what the prophet was saying, even if they could not explain it in the same terms. The decision to leave the Eastern Kingdoms was not made lightly. Many orcs had only recently been freed from the internment camps. They had no desire to flee again, to abandon the lands they had just begun to claim as their own. They wanted to fight, to prove that they would never again be prisoners, to carve out a homeland through strength and determination. But Thrall convinced them. He spoke of the prophet's warning, of the darkness that was coming, of the need to find a place where the Horde could truly be safe. He reminded them that they were not running from defeat, but racing toward destiny, that Kalimdor offered opportunities that the Eastern Kingdoms could never provide. And eventually, reluctantly, the Horde agreed. The prophet told Thrall to take his people across the sea, to the continent of Kalimdor, where ancient forces awaited, and where the Horde might find the destiny that had been denied them. It was a leap of faith, a journey into the unknown based on nothing but the word of a stranger. But Thrall had learned to trust his instincts, and something about the prophet's warning rang true. The Horde built ships, or commandeered them, constructing a fleet that could carry thousands of orcs across the ocean. It was a massive undertaking, perhaps the largest construction project the orcs had ever attempted. Shipwrights worked day and night, using skills that many of them were learning for the first time. The orcs were not a seafaring people, had no tradition of naval construction, but they adapted and learned because their survival depended upon it. The fleet that eventually set sail was a ragtag collection of vessels. Proper warships captured from human ports, converted merchant vessels purchased from neutral traders, crude boats built by orcish hands that were barely seaworthy. It was not an impressive armada, but it was enough to carry the Horde across the ocean. The voyage was difficult, beset by storms and shortages, tested at every turn. Many died during the crossing, claimed by the sea or by the diseases that spread through the crowded holds. The ships were not designed to carry so many passengers, and conditions below decks were harsh. Orcs who had never been on water before suffered terribly from seasickness, and some simply lost hope, unable to believe that there was anything waiting for them on the other side of the endless ocean. Thrall walked among his people during the voyage, offering what comfort he could, using his shamanic abilities to ease their suffering where possible. He called upon the elements of water and air to calm the seas when storms threatened, to fill the sails when winds died, to guide the fleet toward their destination. The spirits were with him, he believed, helping him lead his people to the promised land. During the voyage, the Horde encountered the Darkspear Trolls, a tribe of jungle trolls who had been driven from their home by aggressive murlocs and a mysterious sea witch who had claimed dominion over the waters they depended upon. The Darkspear had been a proud people once, masters of their island home, but the sea witch's attacks had reduced them to refugees clinging to life on shrinking stretches of safe territory. When Thrall's fleet encountered them, the Darkspear were on the verge of annihilation. The Sea Witch had summoned a massive storm that threatened to destroy both the trolls, remaining settlements, and the orcish ships. Thrall could have fled, could have used the storm as cover to escape and continue his voyage to Kalimdor. Instead, he ordered his warriors to land and help the trolls. The battle against the Sea Witch was fierce. Thrall and his shamans worked to counter her magical storms, while orcish warriors fought the murlocs and other creatures she had enslaved. Sen'jin, the leader of the Darkspear, fought alongside Thrall, and the two developed a mutual respect that transcended the differences between their peoples. But victory came at a terrible cost. Sen'jin was captured during the fighting and killed by the Sea Witch before Thrall could reach him. His death was a blow to the Darkspear, who had looked to him for guidance through their darkest hours. But it also cemented the bond between the trolls and the Horde, for Thrall had risked everything to try to save their leader. Sen'jin's son, Vol'jin, assumed leadership of the Darkspear and pledged his people to the Horde. It was the first step in building the new coalition that Thrall envisioned, an alliance of races united not by demonic corruption, but by mutual benefit and respect. Vol'jin would become one of Thrall's most trusted allies in the years to come, a voice of wisdom who often challenged the Warchief's decisions when he believed they were wrong. The trolls brought their own traditions and strengths to the Horde, enriching the culture that Thrall was trying to build. They were master hunters and warriors, skilled in jungle combat and guerrilla tactics. They practiced a form of spiritualism that paralleled Orcish shamanism in many ways, communicating with spirits called Loa who guided and empowered their followers. Their shamans, called shadow hunters, wielded powers that complemented but did not duplicate what Orcish shamans could do. The Horde made landfall on the shores of Kalimdor, a vast continent that had never known the tread of Orcish feet. The land was harsh, but full of potential, a place where new beginnings might truly be possible. Thrall looked upon the desert landscape and saw not desolation, but opportunity. Here, finally, the orcs could build something that was truly their own. The initial exploration was challenging. The Barrens, as the region came to be known, was a dry and unforgiving land where water was scarce and the wildlife was dangerous. The orcs, who had known the forests and mountains of the eastern kingdoms, found themselves struggling to adapt to this new environment. But they were determined, driven by the promise of freedom and the hope that they could create something lasting. Soon after arriving, the Horde encountered the Tauren, a race of noble bovine people who had lived on Kalimdor since ancient times. The Tauren were being hunted by centaur raiders, driven from their ancestral lands by enemies that seemed to multiply faster than they could be defeated. Their chieftain, Cairn Bloodhoof, led his people in a desperate flight from their pursuers. The centaur were savage and relentless, creatures of primal rage who had been warring against the Tauren for generations. They showed no mercy to those they caught, slaughtering entire tribes and desecrating their sacred sites. The Tauren, despite their great strength and martial traditions, were simply outnumbered. Each year, they lost more territory, more lives, more hope. Thrall offered the aid of the Horde without hesitation. Here were people in need, people who faced extinction at the hands of brutal enemies, people who had done nothing to deserve their fate. The orcs knew what it meant to be hunted, to be hated, to face enemies who wanted only their destruction. They could not stand by and watch it happen to others. The orcs and the Tauren fought together against the centaur, driving back the raiders and securing safe passage for Cairn's people. The battle was fierce, the centaur fighting with desperate fury, but they had never faced warriors like the orcs. Thrall's shamanic power devastated their formations, and the orcish warriors cut through their ranks with disciplined precision. In the wake of this shared victory, Cairn pledged the Tauren's allegiance to the Horde, recognizing in Thrall a leader of honor and wisdom. It was not a pledge given lightly. The Tauren had lived independently for millennia, had never bent knee to any outside power. But Cairn saw in Thrall something that convinced him the Horde was worthy of alliance, a commitment to honor, to mutual respect, to building something greater than any single race could achieve alone. The Tauren brought much to the alliance. They were a shamanic people, attuned to the spirits of nature and the land in ways that resonated with what Thrall was trying to restore among the orcs. Their connection to the Earth Mother, the spirit they revered above all others, gave them insights into the elements that even Drekthar had not possessed. From the Tauren, the orcs learned more about living in harmony with the world around them, about honoring the spirits and maintaining balance with nature. Cairn became one of Thrall's closest advisors, a voice of elder wisdom that balanced the young warchief's sometimes impetuous nature. Their friendship would last for decades, a bond between two peoples who had found each other in their darkest hours and risen together into the light. The promised evil that the prophet had warned about arrived as foretold. The Burning Legion, the same demonic army that had corrupted the orcs on Draenor, launched its invasion of Azeroth. Demons poured through portals across the land, spreading corruption and destruction wherever they appeared. The Legion's strategy centered on the world tree Nordrassil, the great tree that stood atop Mount Hyjal and served as the source of the Night Elves' immortality. If the demons could reach the world tree and corrupt it, they would gain access to the power it contained, power that could fuel their conquest of Azeroth and beyond. Standing in the Legion's path was an unlikely alliance. The prophet brought together three forces that had every reason to distrust and fight one another. The Horde, led by Thrall, the human survivors of Lordaeron, led by Jaina Proudmoore, and the Night Elves, led by Tyrande Whisperwind and Malfurion Stormrage. Jaina was like Thrall in many ways, a leader who sought peace even as she was forced to wage war. She had seen her homeland destroyed by the undead scourge, had watched the man she loved fall to corruption and evil, had led her people across the sea to find a new home. When the prophet told her that survival required alliance with the Horde, she overcame her people's hatred and agreed. Their first meetings were tense. Thrall and Jaina were products of societies that had been at war for decades. Their peoples had killed each other's families, destroyed each other's cities, committed atrocities that cried out for vengeance. But both leaders understood that the Legion was a greater threat than any previous conflict, that survival required setting aside old hatreds and working together. The Night Elves were even more reluctant to accept outsiders. They had lived in isolation for 10,000 years, since the War of the Ancients, when the Legion had first invaded and been repelled only at tremendous cost. They viewed both orcs and humans as young races, children playing with forces they did not understand, potential threats to the balance they had maintained for millennia. But the Legion forced their hand. Archimond, one of the leaders of the demonic invasion, marched upon Mount Hyjal with an army that dwarfed anything the defenders could muster. The Night Elves could not defeat him alone. They needed the Horde and the Alliance, needed every warrior who could hold a weapon and every mage who could cast a spell. The Battle of Mount Hyjal was the defining moment of Thrall's early leadership. He commanded the Orcish forces in a desperate defense of the mountain's lower slopes, buying time for the Night Elves to prepare their ultimate weapon. Wave after wave of demons crashed against Orcish defenses, and wave after wave was thrown back through a combination of martial prowess and shamanic power. The defense was organized in layers, with each layer designed to slow the demonic advance and inflict maximum casualties on the attackers. Jaina's human forces held the first line, then fell back through Thrall's Orcish positions. Then both retreated through the Night Elf defenses at the summit. Each withdrawal was planned and orderly, trading ground for time while maintaining cohesion. Thrall called upon the elements throughout the battle, summoning earthquakes to disrupt demon formations, calling lightning to strike down flying attackers, invoking fire to burn back the corrupted creatures that seemed to have no end. The shamanic power he wielded was a beacon, too, His warriors, proof that the old ways had returned, and that the orcs fought not as demonic slaves, but as free beings connected to the spirits of the world. The demons were relentless. Doom guards swept down from the skies, their flaming swords cutting through armor and flesh with equal ease. Fellhounds raced ahead of the main formations, their hunger for magic drawing them toward the spellcasters on both sides. Infernals crashed from the heavens like falling stars, crushing entire squads of defenders wherever they landed, and behind them all came the foot soldiers of the Legion, the endless ranks of corrupted creatures that served the burning crusade. Grom Hellscream fell during this battle, but not in the defense of the mountain. The chieftain of the Warsong clan, who had taught Thrall so much about Orcish heritage, who had drunk demon blood twice and paid the price both times, had a different fate awaiting him. Before the final battle, while the demons were still gathering their strength, Grom had sought out the source of the corruption that had plagued his people. Manaroth, the pit lord whose blood had first enslaved the orcs, had returned with the Legion's invasion. His presence was a reminder of everything the orcs had been forced to become, of the corruption that had transformed a proud warrior people into mindless killing machines. Grom, carrying the weight of his double corruption, could not allow Manaroth to continue existing. Their confrontation was legendary. Grom Hellscream, wielding the axe Gorehowl that had been passed through generations of his clan, faced the demon whose blood had enslaved his people. The battle was brief but devastating. Grom struck the killing blow, his axe splitting Manaroth's skull, but the demon's death released an explosion of fell energy that consumed the Warsong chieftain as well. Thrall reached Grom in his final moments. The chieftain of the Warsong, the mentor who had taught Thrall about Orcish culture and tradition, lay dying in a clearing stained with demonic blood. But there was peace on Grom's face, a serenity that had never been there in life. He had redeemed himself. He had broken the curse. The orcs were free. "Is it over?" Grom asked, and Thrall told him that yes, the blood curse was lifted, that the orcs were free from demonic taint. Grom's last words would echo through Orcish history. "I have freed myself." He died in Thrall's arms, at peace at last, the first orc to truly choose his own death rather than dying as a slave to demonic masters. The Night Elves' plan centered on the World Tree itself. Malfurion had devised a ritual that would channel the power of Nordrassil against Archimond, destroying the demon lord at the cost of the tree's enchantments. When the ritual was complete, 10,000 years of accumulated power exploded outward, annihilating Archimond and shattering the demon's offensive. The Legion was defeated, but the cost was immense. The Night Elves had sacrificed their immortality, the gift that had sustained them through millennia of watch over the sleeping druids and the sealed passages to other realms. The Horde and Alliance had suffered terrible casualties, and the world itself had been scarred by the conflict. But they had won. They had proven that the peoples of Azeroth could unite against existential threats, could set aside their differences in the face of greater dangers. For Thrall, it was validation of everything he had been trying to build since escaping Durnholde Keep. In the aftermath of the Battle of Mount Hyjal, Thrall led the Horde to the arid lands of eastern Kalimdor. There, in a harsh but defensible region, he established a new homeland for his people, He named it Durotar in honor of his father Durotan, whose sacrifice had made Thrall's survival possible. The capital of this new nation was Argrimmar, a city built into the canyons and mesas of the land. It was not a beautiful place by human or elvish standards, but it was perfect for the orcs, defensible, practical, suited to their needs and their culture. Every building, every wall, every forge was constructed by orcish hands, a physical manifestation of the rebirth Thrall had worked so hard to achieve. Thrall's horde was different from the one that had invaded Azeroth decades earlier. There were no warlocks practicing demonic magic in the streets, no sacrifices to dark powers, no corruption seeping through the population. Instead, shamans walked openly, communing with the elements and teaching the next generation the old ways that had been lost. The relationship with Jaina Proudmoore continued after the battle. She had established her own settlement in Kalimdor, a coastal city called Theramore that served as a haven for human refugees from Lordaeron. Thrall and Jaina maintained diplomatic contact, working to build a peace that neither of their peoples truly wanted, but that both leaders understood was necessary. It was an uneasy peace, tested constantly by those on both sides who preferred conflict. Some humans could not forget the wars, could not look at an orc without seeing the monsters who had destroyed Stormwind and laid waste to Lordaeron. Some orcs could not forget the internment camps, the years of captivity and abuse, the deaths of friends and family at human hands. Thrall and Jaina navigated these tensions as best they could. They met in secret when necessary, communicated through trusted messengers, worked to diffuse conflicts before they could escalate into open war. Their friendship became one of the most important diplomatic relationships in Azeroth's history, a bridge between enemies that neither side could afford to burn. The peace was threatened by an unexpected source, Jaina's own father. Admiral Dalen Proudmoore arrived in Kalimdor with a fleet of ships and a heart full of vengeance. He was one of the greatest naval commanders in human history, the ruler of Kul Tiras and a veteran of both wars against the Horde. The orcs had killed his son Derek during the Second War, and that loss had festered in his soul ever since. He could not accept that his daughter had allied with orcs, could not understand that the Horde had changed. All he saw were the monsters who had killed his son, who had brought fire and death to everything he loved. In his mind, there was no such thing as a reformed orc, no possibility of peace with creatures who had proven themselves capable of such destruction. Dalen attacked the Horde without provocation, seeking to finish the war that had never truly ended in his mind. His forces were well trained and well equipped, veterans of naval warfare who had been hardened by years of conflict. They struck at orcish shipping, raided coastal settlements, demonstrated that the peace Thrall had built was fragile and incomplete. Jaina was forced to choose between her father and the peace she had worked so hard to build. The Admiral demanded that she stand with her own kind, that she remember her duty to humanity and reject the monsters she had inexplicably befriended. He could not understand why she hesitated, could not comprehend that she saw the orcs as people rather than animals. It was a terrible decision, one that would haunt her for years to come. In the end, she chose peace, stepping aside as Thrall and his forces defeated her father's fleet and killed the Admiral himself. She did not fight against her father, But she did not fight for him either. She watched from a distance as the battle was decided, and she mourned when it was over. The tragedy strengthened the bond between Thrall and Jaina, even as it cost her the love of her people. Kultiras, the island nation that Dalen had ruled, blamed Jaina for her father's death and cut ties with her entirely. They called her a traitor, said that she had chosen orcs over her own kind, denounced her in terms that grew harsher with each passing year. She had sacrificed her family for peace with the Horde, and many humans would never forgive her for it. Thrall understood the weight of her choice. He had lost Taretha trying to escape Durnholde Keep, had watched Doomhammer fall in battle, had buried Grom Hellscream after Mount Hyjal. He knew what it meant to sacrifice those you loved for the greater good, knew the loneliness that came from being a leader who had to make impossible decisions. Their friendship deepened into something that transcended politics. They were kindred spirits, two leaders who bore the weight of their people's futures on their shoulders, two individuals who had chosen peace in a world that seemed determined to find new reasons for war. The years that followed Mount Hyjal and the founding of Durotar were not peaceful, but they were productive. Thrall worked to consolidate the Horde, to integrate the various races that had joined under his banner, to build the infrastructure that a civilization needed to thrive. The construction of Orgrimmar was a massive undertaking that consumed years of effort and countless orcish lives. The city was built into the canyons of Durotar, its walls rising from the red rock like natural extensions of the landscape. Every stone was quarried by orcish hands, every timber harvested from the sparse forests, every forge stoked with ore dug from mines that the orcs had carved themselves. Thrall wanted Orgrimmar to be more than just a fortress. He wanted it to be a home, a place where orcs could raise families and build lives without the shadow of war constantly hanging over them. He designed the city with markets and gathering places, with training grounds for warriors and quiet spaces for shamans to commune with the spirits. He wanted the next generation of orcs to grow up knowing that they were free, that they had a homeland that no one could take from them. The city's defenses were formidable nonetheless. Thrall had learned from the wars that had shaped his people's history. The walls of Orgrimmar could withstand siege engines, and the narrow canyons that led to its gates were natural kill zones where any attacking army would be devastated. The city was designed to be defended, but not to invite attack, strong enough to deter aggressors without being so threatening that neighbors felt compelled to strike preemptively. The Tauren established their own settlements in Mulgore, a great mesa in central Kalimdor that reminded them of the plains they had lost to the Centaur. Thunderbluff rose on the central plateau, a city of tents and lodges built on multiple tiers, connected by rope bridges and elevators. It was beautiful in a way that Orgrimmar would never be, harmonious with the land rather than carved from it. Cairn Bloodhoof remained one of Thrall's most trusted advisors, bringing the wisdom of his long years to the Warchief's councils. The old chieftain had seen much in his life, had lost and gained, had learned patience that younger leaders often lacked. He was not afraid to disagree with Thrall, to counsel caution when the Warchief might have preferred action, to remind him that the consequences of war fell hardest on those who had the least power to influence it. The Darkspear Trolls made their home on the Echo Isles off the coast of Durotar, maintaining their traditions while contributing to the Horde's strength. Vol'jin proved to be a leader as capable as his father had been, guiding his people through the challenges of adaptation to a new land while preserving the essential character of troll culture. The Shadow Hunters continued their communion with the Eloa, and the Darkspear warriors earned a reputation as some of the most skilled fighters in the Horde. New peoples sought membership in the Horde. The Forsaken, undead humans who had broken free from the Lich King's control, petitioned for alliance. Their leader, Sylvanas Windrunner, was a complicated figure, once a high elf ranger, killed and raised as a banshee, now leading a faction of undead who wanted nothing more than to exist in a world that feared and hated them. Thrall's decision to accept the Forsaken was controversial. Many orcs remembered the Scourge, the undead army that had swept through Lordaeron and eventually reached Kalimdor. The Forsaken looked like the monsters they had fought, spoke with voices that echoed from beyond the grave, existed in a state that seemed an offense against the natural order. But Thrall saw in the Forsaken echoes of his own people's story. They had been used as tools by a greater power, had been stripped of their identity, and forced to serve evil against their will. They had broken free and now sought a place in a world that did not want them. How could he deny them the chance that he had given the orcs, the opportunity to prove that past corruption did not define future potential? The Forsaken joined the Horde, establishing their capital in the ruins of Lordaeron. They brought capabilities that complemented orcish strength, alchemical knowledge, intelligence networks, a willingness to employ tactics that more honorable races would not consider. They were not trusted allies, but they were useful ones. The Blood Elves came next, the remnants of the High Elves whose kingdom of Quel'Thalas had been devastated by the Scourge. The destruction of their Sunwell had left them addicted to magic, desperate for sources of power to fuel their needs. They had been rejected by the Alliance, had suffered betrayal at the hands of humans who had once been allies, and they came to the Horde seeking acceptance. Thrall accepted them as well, though with reservations. The Blood Elves' dependency on magic troubled him, reminded him of the demonic corruption that had enslaved the orcs. But he believed that with time and guidance, they might find healthier ways to satisfy their needs. And the Horde was stronger for their membership, their magical knowledge and ancient traditions, adding depth to the coalition. Through all of this expansion and development, Thrall never forgot the spiritual foundation he was trying to build. He continued his shamanic practice, communing with the elements and teaching others to do the same. He established a structure for shamanic training, ensuring that future generations of orcs would grow up connected to the spirits rather than cut off from them. The training center was established in the Valley of Spirits within Orgrimmar, a place where the elements seemed particularly willing to communicate with those who approached them properly. Young orcs with shamanic aptitude were brought there to learn the old ways, to understand what their people had lost and how it might be regained. The training was demanding, requiring not just spiritual sensitivity, but also the discipline to approach the elements with humility rather than the domination that warlocks had once practiced. Thrall taught there himself whenever his duties as Warchief permitted. He found a satisfaction in passing on what Drekthar had taught him, in watching young orcs feel the touch of the elements for the first time. Some of his students would surpass him in power, he knew, would develop connections to the spirits that he could only dream of. That was as it should be. The goal was not to make the students dependent on their teacher, but to help them find their own paths. The elements responded to this new generation of shamans with an enthusiasm that surprised even Thrall. The spirits had waited so long for the orcs to return to them, had watched in sorrow as an entire people fell to demonic corruption and lost their spiritual heritage. Now that the connection was being restored, the elements seemed eager to help, offering guidance and power to those who approached them properly. The Tauren shamans helped in this restoration. They had maintained their own traditions through the long years when Orcish shamanism had been lost, and their knowledge complemented what the orcs were relearning. Tauren teachers worked alongside Orcish ones, sharing techniques and insights that neither people alone possessed. The cross-pollination of traditions created something new and powerful, a shamanic practice that drew on multiple sources while remaining true to the fundamental principles. The shamans became the spiritual center of the new horde. They replaced the warlocks who had led the orcs astray, provided guidance and healing where dark magic had once brought only destruction. When communities faced challenges, it was the shamans who were called upon to communicate with the elements and seek solutions. When individuals struggled with personal crises, it was the shamans who offered counsel based on their understanding of balance and harmony. Thrall was not the only shaman anymore, not even the most powerful, but he remained the symbol of what shamanism meant for his people: redemption, connection, hope. His journey from slavery to spiritual awakening demonstrated that no orc was beyond saving, that the corruption of the past did not have to define the future. Every young shaman who felt the elements respond to their call was following in his footsteps, proving again that the old ways could be restored. When the portal to Outland, the shattered remnants of Draenor, was reopened, Thrall knew he had to go through it. Outland was his homeworld, the place where his parents had been born and where the Orcish race had first emerged. It was also the source of new threats, as the demon lord Illidan had established himself as master of the broken world. The journey through the dark portal was disorienting. Thrall had heard stories of Draenor all his life, had imagined the world where his parents had grown up and where the Orcish race had developed over thousands of years. But nothing could have prepared him for what he found on the other side. Outland was not a world, but the corpse of one. The sky was not blue, but a swirling chaos of colors that suggested torn dimensions rather than natural atmosphere. The land did not extend to horizons, but ended in shattered cliffs that dropped into endless void. This was what happened when a world died, when the reckless use of dark magic tore reality itself apart. What Thrall found beyond the portal was devastating. The orcs who had remained behind, who had never come through the dark portal to Azeroth, had suffered terribly in the years since the world shattered. Many had been corrupted even further than those who invaded Azeroth, their skin turned red by additional doses of demonic power. Others had been enslaved by the demon lords, who now contested control of the broken world. Still others had simply died, claimed by the hostile environment or the endless wars. The first orcs Thrall encountered were the fell orcs, creatures so consumed by demonic corruption that they barely resembled the people he knew. Their red skin marked them as doubly corrupted, twice cursed by the blood of pit lords. They attacked without recognition, without mercy, without any trace of the intelligence or honor that orcs were supposed to possess. Thrall was forced to fight and kill beings who should have been his kin, but there was hope as well. In the marshes of Nagrand, a region that had somehow retained its beauty despite the destruction that had consumed the rest of the world, Thrall discovered the Maghar. These were orcs who had never drunk the demon blood, who had maintained their brown skin and spiritual connection through all the horrors they had endured. They had hidden during the corruption, had survived through cunning and determination, had preserved themselves against impossible odds. Among the Maghar was Garrosh Hellscream, son of the legendary Grom, who had been too ill to drink the blood and had been left behind when the Horde invaded Azeroth. Garrosh was young still, but old enough to understand the shame that he believed hung over his family. He knew that his father had been the first to drink Mannoroth's blood, the one who had led the orcs into demonic slavery. Garrosh was a broken figure when Thrall found him. He knew only shame when he thought of his father, believed that Grom's legacy was one of corruption and destruction. He did not know that Grom had redeemed himself at Mount Hejal, that his father's final act had been to break the curse of Mannoroth and free the orcs from their demonic bondage. Thrall told Garrosh the truth about Grom. He described the battle against Mannoroth, the sacrifice that had saved the orcish race, the redemption that had come at the cost of Grom's life. He gave Garrosh reason to be proud of his heritage, rather than ashamed, transformed a broken young orc into someone with purpose and drive. Perhaps this was a mistake. Thrall could not have known what Garrosh would become, the destruction he would cause, and the shame he would bring upon the Horde. At the time, he saw only a young orc who needed guidance, who needed to understand that the sins of the fathers did not have to define the sons. In Outland, Thrall also met Great Mother Gaia, his own grandmother, who had survived all the years since Durotan's death. She told him the name his parents had chosen for him, Goel, meaning Redeemer. It was the name he had been denied at Durnholde Keep, the identity that Blackmoore had tried to strip away. Learning it was like reclaiming a piece of himself that had been stolen before he could even remember. Goel, the Redeemer. He had spent his entire life fulfilling the destiny contained in that name, without even knowing what he was called. He had redeemed his people from demonic corruption, from captivity, from despair. He had rebuilt their culture and restored their connection to the spirits. He had done exactly what his parents had dreamed he would do. The elemental turmoil that preceded the cataclysm forced Thrall to make the most difficult decision of his tenure as Warchief. The elements were growing increasingly unstable, their fury building towards something catastrophic. As a shaman, Thrall felt their distress more acutely than almost anyone else on Azeroth. He knew that something had to be done, that the brewing disaster would not wait for political convenience. But the Horde needed leadership. The faction had grown complex, its various races pulling in different directions, its relationship with the Alliance always teetering on the edge of war. Thrall could not be both Warchief and the shaman the elements needed. He had to choose. He chose to pass the mantle of Warchief to Garrosh Hellscream. It seemed like the right decision at the time. Garrosh had proven himself a capable military commander, had led Orcish forces to victory in Northrend against the Lich King. He embodied the martial strength that the Horde valued, projected the power that enemies needed to fear. Thrall believed that with proper guidance, Garrosh would grow into a leader worthy of the position. The other members of the Horde leadership were not convinced. Cairn Bloodhoof openly objected, warning that Garrosh was too aggressive, too focused on conquest rather than community. Vol'jin expressed similar concerns, noting that the young orc lacked the wisdom that came from experience. Even Sylvanas, who cared little for orcish politics, seemed skeptical. But Thrall was convinced he had no choice. The elements were calling, and their call could not be ignored. He named Garrosh Warchief and departed to join the Earthen Ring, the shamanic order that was working to calm the elemental fury building throughout Azeroth. Thrall found a new purpose in this work and a new relationship as well. Agra was a Mag'har shaman, a strong-willed woman who did not treat Thrall with the reverence that others showed the former warchief. She challenged him, pushed him, forced him to confront aspects of himself that he had long avoided. Their relationship developed as they worked together to address the elemental crisis. Agra helped Thrall understand that his connection to the elements had been incomplete, that he had been holding back parts of himself out of fear and uncertainty. Under her guidance, he grew stronger in his shamanic practice, more complete in his connection to the spirits. When the cataclysm finally came, when Deathwing burst from Deepholm and shattered the world, Thrall was at the Maelstrom working to hold reality together. The corrupted dragon aspect had torn wounds in the world that threatened to swallow everything, had released forces that could have ended life on Azeroth entirely. The emergence of Deathwing was catastrophic beyond anything that had happened since the Sundering 10,000 years before. The former Earth Warder, driven mad by the whispers of the old gods during his millennia of imprisonment, exploded from the elemental plane with enough force to reshape continents. Coastlines collapsed into the sea. Mountains rose where plains had been. The Barrens was split in two by a river of fire. Aberdeen was destroyed by the flooding of the coast. Thousands died in the initial hours of the cataclysm, and thousands more would die in the weeks and months that followed. Thrall felt every wound that Deathwing inflicted on the world. His connection to the elements meant that their suffering was his suffering, their screaming his screaming. The earth that had been his ally now thrashed in agony. The water that had been his friend now rose in terrible tsunamis. The fire that had warmed him now burned uncontrolled across vast stretches of land. The air that had carried his prayers now howled with winds that destroyed everything in their path. At the Maelstrom, the massive whirlpool at the center of the Great Sea, where Deathwing had emerged, Thrall and the other members of the Earthen Ring worked desperately to stabilize the rift between Azeroth and the elemental plane. The barrier that normally separated these realms had been shattered by Deathwing's emergence, and elemental beings of terrible power were pouring through, adding to the chaos. The battle against Deathwing was unlike anything Thrall had faced before. This was not a conflict of armies, but of primal forces, not a war of nations, but a struggle for the survival of the world itself. Thrall worked alongside the dragon aspects, the ancient beings who had been empowered by the Titans to protect Azeroth, channeling powers that dwarfed anything he had wielded as Warchief. The plan to defeat Deathwing centered on the Dragon Soul, the artifact that the corrupted aspect had himself created during the War of the Ancients. This weapon, imbued with power from all 5 dragon aspects, was the only thing capable of destroying Deathwing. But the dragon's soul had been lost in time, and retrieving it required a journey into the past that was fraught with danger. Heroes traveled through time to the War of the Ancients, to the moment just after the dragon's soul was created, and claimed it before it could be lost. They brought it back to the present, where the dragon aspects empowered it once more with their remaining strength. And then it was given to Thrall. In the end, it was Thrall who wielded the dragon soul against Deathwing. The artifact required a mortal to channel its power, and Thrall was the only one capable of surviving the strain. The elements of Azeroth, recognizing him as their champion, lent him their strength for the final confrontation. Earth and fire, water and air, all of them flowed through him as he raised the dragon soul against the monster who had nearly destroyed the world. The blast struck Deathwing at the Maelstrom, where the corrupted aspect had fled after failed attempts to destroy him at Wormrest Temple. The dragon soul's power tore through his corrupted form, ripping apart the armor of Elementium that held his body together. Deathwing fell into the Maelstrom, and for a moment it seemed like the battle might be over. But the corruption would not die so easily. From the depths of the Maelstrom, Deathwing emerged in a form that was barely recognizable as a dragon, a writhing mass of corruption and madness that clawed its way toward the surface. The final battle took place on the corrupted aspect's back, as heroes fought to pry away the Elementium plates that protected his flesh, while Thrall channeled the dragon soul's remaining power. When Deathwing finally died, truly and completely, the dragon soul shattered. Its power was expended, burned away in the effort to destroy something that should never have existed. He struck down the corrupted aspect, ending the immediate threat of the cataclysm, even as the world continued to reel from the damage already done. The dragon aspects sacrificed their immortality in the final battle, their powers burned away in the effort to destroy Deathwing. It was the end of an age, the closing of a chapter in Azeroth's history that had begun before even the Night Elves rose to prominence. Thrall witnessed this sacrifice, understood its weight, knew that the world would have to find new protectors now that the old Guardians had given everything they had. In the wake of Deathwing's defeat, Thrall and Agra were married. Their union was blessed with a son, whom they named Durak. For a time, Thrall enjoyed something like peace, the simple joys of family that had been denied him since his parents' death. He farmed, he raised his child, he continued his shamanic work without the weight of political leadership. But he could not ignore what was happening to the Horde. Garrosh had changed the Horde in Thrall's absence, and not for the better. The new Warchief emphasized Orcish supremacy over the coalition that Thrall had built, treating the other races as servants rather than allies. He pursued aggressive expansion, launched attacks on alliance, territories, escalated conflicts that Thrall had worked to keep contained. The transformation was gradual at first, subtle enough that many did not recognize it for what it was. Garrosh spoke of strength and pride, values that resonated with Orcish warriors who remembered the shame of the internment camps. He reminded them that they were conquerors, that their ancestors had been feared throughout 2 worlds, that the orcs did not need to apologize for their nature, but the rhetoric grew darker over time. Garrosh began speaking of orcish destiny, of a horde that existed to serve orcish interests rather than the interests of all its member races. He marginalized the Tauren and the Trolls, questioned the loyalty of the Forsaken, openly disdained the Blood Elves as weaklings who contributed nothing of value. The coalition that Thrall had built began to fracture under the pressure of Garrosh's favoritism. The war against the Alliance intensified. Where Thrall had sought peace and stability, Garrosh sought expansion and dominance. He launched invasions of Alliance territories, committed atrocities that horrified even his own supporters, made clear that he would not stop until the Horde ruled all of Azeroth. The breaking point came with the destruction of Theramore. Garrosh used a weapon called the Mana Bomb, an artifact of immense magical power that had been developed by the Blood Elves to annihilate the city that Jaina had built. The explosion killed thousands of humans instantly, vaporizing buildings and people alike. The magical fallout killed thousands more, poisoning the land for miles around. Theramore had been more than just a city. It had been a symbol of everything Thrall and Jaina had worked to achieve, a proof that peace between the factions was possible. Its destruction was not just an act of war, but a repudiation of everything Thrall believed in. Garrosh was declaring that there would be no peace, that the only future was one of eternal conflict. Jaina survived the destruction, but she was transformed by it. The woman who had been Thrall's closest ally among the humans, who had sacrificed her father for peace with the Horde, who had always counseled reconciliation and understanding, was now filled with rage. She nearly destroyed Orgrimmar in retaliation, was barely talked down by Kalecgos and others who reminded her that such an act would make her no better than Garrosh. Thrall blamed himself. He had chosen Garrosh as his successor, had believed that the son of Grom could become the leader the Horde needed. He had been wrong, catastrophically wrong, and the price of his mistake was being paid in blood. Thousands were dead because of his choice. The alliance between Horde and Alliance, which had been fragile but real, was now shattered beyond any hope of easy repair. The Horde fractured. Vol'jin and the other faction leaders, who had opposed Garrosh from the beginning, organized a rebellion against his rule. The troll leader had never trusted Garrosh, had warned Thrall against appointing him, had watched with growing horror as every prediction came true. Now he moved openly against the Warchief, gathering support from Tauren, trolls, and even some orcs who could not stomach what their leader had become. They sought allies wherever they could find them, including among the Alliance forces who were already at war with Garrosh's horde. It was a desperate move, allying with the enemy against their own Warchief, but the alternative was to allow Garrosh to continue his reign of terror. The rebellion recruited from both factions, united not by loyalty to Horde or Alliance, but by opposition to tyranny. Thrall joined the rebellion. He could not ignore his responsibility for creating the monster that Garrosh had become. He fought alongside Vol'jin and the other rebels, using his shamanic powers against the Warchief he had installed, trying to undo the damage his choice had caused. It was not enough, could never be enough, but it was all he could do. The siege of Orgrimmar was the culmination of this conflict. Alliance and Horde forces together assaulted the capital that Thrall had built, fighting through the streets and into the depths beneath the city where Garrosh had established his seat of power. The corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined, with Garrosh drawing on the power of the old gods themselves in his quest for domination. In the final confrontation, Garrosh was defeated, some but not killed. Thrall wanted to execute him for his crimes, but the decision was taken out of his hands. Garrosh was to face trial, to answer for what he had done before a tribunal of all races. The trial never concluded. Garrosh escaped with the help of a renegade bronze dragon, fleeing into an alternate timeline where he hoped to create a new horde that would serve his vision of Orcish supremacy. Thrall pursued him, traveling to an alternate Draenor that had never known the corruption of the Burning Legion. On this alternate Draenor, Thrall finally faced Garrosh in single combat. The Mak'gora, the Orcish duel of honor, was supposed to determine which of them was right about the nature of the Horde, about the path the Orcish people should follow. The duel was not clean. Thrall used his shamanic powers to strike Garrosh down, and some argued that this violated the rules of the Mak'gora. Garrosh himself accused Thrall of cheating, claimed that the elements had no place in a contest meant to test Orcish strength alone. Thrall killed him anyway. Perhaps he was right to do so, perhaps not. But Garrosh was dead, and the threat he represented was ended. Or so Thrall thought. The killing had consequences that Thrall did not anticipate. His connection to the elements, the bond that had defined him since his training with Drekthar, began to fade. Whether it was guilt over the circumstances of Garrosh's death or some deeper spiritual wound, the elements seemed to pull away from him. For the first time since becoming a shaman, Thrall felt alone in his own soul. The years that followed were a period of retreat and reflection for Thrall. He stepped back from Horde politics, letting Vol'jin lead as Warchief while he tried to repair his damaged connection to the elements. He spent time with Agra and their growing family, seeking peace in domesticity while the world continued to churn around him. The retreat to Nagrand in Outland gave Thrall space to confront what he had done. He meditated for hours each day, reaching out to the elements as he had done so many times before, but the connection that had once flowed so naturally now felt forced and incomplete. The spirits answered his calls, but reluctantly, as if something had come between them. Agra helped him understand that the problem was not external, but internal. The guilt he felt over Garrosh's death, the questions about whether he had acted honorably, the doubt that had crept into his certainty, all of these things blocked his connection to the elements. Shamanism required harmony between the shaman and the spirits. Thrall was at war with himself, and that internal conflict made harmony impossible. The process of healing was slow and painful. Thrall had to confront not just the killing of Garrosh, but every decision that had led to that moment. He had to examine his choice to make Garrosh Warchief, to question whether pride or necessity had truly driven that decision. He had to accept that good intentions did not excuse the consequences of his actions. Through meditation and reflection, through long conversations with Agra and longer periods of silence, Thrall gradually began to rebuild. The elements did not return all at once, but in fragments, in moments of connection that came and went like waves on a shore. It was not the complete bond he had known before Garrosh's death, but it was something. The Legion returned, launching the greatest invasion since the War of the Ancients. Demons poured through portals across Azeroth, overwhelming defenses that had been built to repel conventional armies, not the infinite legions of the Burning Crusade. Cities fell within hours. Nations that had stood for millennia were swept away in the tide of green fire and corruption. Vol'jin called a united assault on the Broken Shore, the island where the Legion had established its primary beachhead. Alliance and Horde forces fought together, setting aside their endless conflicts to face an enemy that threatened to destroy them both. But the assault was a disaster. The demons were too many, too powerful, too prepared for the attack. Vol'jin fell in the initial assault, mortally wounded by a fell blade that carried corruption beyond any healer's ability to cure. The troll Warchief, who had led the rebellion against Garrosh and guided the Horde through years of reconstruction, lay dying as his forces retreated. Before his death, he named an unexpected successor, Sylvanas Windrunner, the Banshee Queen, the leader of the Forsaken. The choice made no sense to many, including Thrall. Vol'jin claimed that the spirits had spoken to him, had shown him that Sylvanas was the one who must lead the Horde through what was coming. But the troll died before he could explain further, and the Horde was left with a Warchief who had never sought the position and who many believed was unfit for it. Thrall served in the war against the Legion, though not in a leadership capacity. His shamanic powers were diminished, his certainty shaken, his role unclear. He fought alongside the champions who struck at the Legion's strongholds, who stormed the Nighthold to defeat Gul'dan, who sailed to the Broken Shore a second time to assault the tomb of Sargeras. He was a warrior among warriors, no longer the Warchief, whose words could move nations. The war against the Legion took the champions of Azeroth to places they had never imagined. They fought across the Broken Isles, reclaiming ancient Vrykul halls and night elf ruins from demonic occupation. They forged alliances with unlikely allies, from the Nightborn elves who had hidden behind their magical barrier for 10,000 years, to the army of the light that had been fighting the Legion across the cosmos. Eventually, they pursued the demons to their homeworld of Argus, the shattered planet that had once been the Eridar homeworld and was now the seat of the Burning Legion's power. There, in the shadow of the Burning Throne, where Sargeras himself was imprisoned, the champions struck the final blow against the Legion's forces and defeated them at the very heart of their power. The victory came at a cost. The world soul of Argus was destroyed in the final battle. Sargeras was imprisoned by the Pantheon, and Azeroth itself was wounded by the Dark Titan's final strike. The sword that Sargeras plunged into the world left a wound that would take years to heal, if it ever healed at all. The war that followed, the conflict between Alliance and Horde that Sylvanas provoked, pulled Thrall back into active involvement. When Sylvanas burned the World Tree Teldrassil, killing thousands of night elves in an act of genocidal cruelty, Thrall could no longer remain on the sidelines. The burning of Teldrassil was an atrocity that echoed through both factions. Thousands of night elves died in the flames, civilians and soldiers alike, burned alive or suffocated by the smoke that rose from the World Tree. The city of Darnassus, home to generations of night elves, ceased to exist in a matter of hours. It was an act of deliberate genocide designed to break the spirit of the Alliance, by demonstrating that no one was safe from the Horde's wrath. Thrall watched from Nagrand as reports of the burning reached him. He remembered the night elves he had fought beside at Mount Hejal, the alliance that had been forged in the defense of Nordrassil. He remembered Tyrande and Malfurion, leaders who had set aside their distrust of orcs to work together against the Legion. He remembered the principles he had established when he founded the new Horde, principles that Sylvanas had thrown away in her pursuit of whatever dark goal now drove her. He was called from his retirement by Varrock Saurfang, the legendary warrior who had served the Horde for decades and who could no longer stomach what Sylvanas was doing to their people. Saurfang had been High Overlord under multiple warchiefs, had fought in every major conflict since the First War, had seen the Horde at its best and its worst. He knew what the Horde was supposed to be, and he knew that Sylvanas was destroying it. Their reunion was not easy. Thrall had retreated from the world, had sought peace in obscurity, while others dealt with the consequences of his choices. Saurfang had remained in the thick of things, had watched as the Horde he loved was twisted into something unrecognizable. There were hard words spoken, accusations and recriminations, questions about why Thrall had not acted sooner. But in the end, they found common ground in their shared love for the Horde and their shared horror at what it had become. Together, they organized a rebellion against Sylvanas, reaching out to other leaders who had grown disillusioned with the Banshee Queen's leadership. It was a dangerous gambit, echoing the rebellion they had organized against Garrosh years before, but the stakes were too high to do nothing. The rebellion grew slowly at first, then faster as Sylvanas' actions became increasingly indefensible. She made alliance with the Naga Queen Azshara, who sought to free the old Godden Zoth from his prison. She conducted dark experiments on the captured Alliance soldiers. She used tactics that disgusted even the Forsaken who had followed her from the beginning. The final confrontation came at the gates of Orgrimmar. Saurfang returned to the city he had defended for so long, now coming not as its protector, but as its liberator. He challenged Sylvanas to Magora, the orcish duel of honor, forcing her to either fight or reveal herself as a coward. Sylvanas accepted the challenge, though it was clear from the beginning that she held Saurfang in contempt. Their battle was brief but brutal, Saurfang's experience and strength against Sylvanas' undead speed and dark magic. In the end, Sylvanas struck the killing blow, her dark powers tearing through the old warrior's defenses. But Saurfang died with a smile on his face. With his last breath, he exposed Sylvanas for what she truly was. "You cannot kill hope," he told her, and her response revealed everything. "You are all nothing," she screamed at the assembled Horde. "This Horde is nothing." The Horde that Sylvanas had led turned against her in that moment. She had admitted that she did not care about them, that their lives and their honor meant nothing to her. She abandoned her position, used her dark powers to tear a hole in reality, and disappeared into the Maw, the realm of death where tormented souls were sent to suffer for eternity. Thrall held Saurfang as the old warrior died, just as he had held Grom Hellscream decades earlier. Another friend lost, another mentor fallen, another price paid for the mistakes that seemed to compound with every passing year. But Saurfang had accomplished what he set out to do. The Horde was free from Sylvanas' control. In the aftermath of Sylvanas' departure, the Horde restructured itself. There would be no more warchiefs, no more single leaders who could drag the faction into wars of aggression. Instead, a council would govern, with representatives from each race having equal voice in decisions that affected them all. The system was designed to prevent another Garrosh, another Sylvanas, another tyrant who could twist the Horde to serve their own ends. Thrall took his place on this council as the representative of the orcs. It was a different kind of leadership than he had known as Warchief, more collaborative and less decisive, but perhaps more sustainable. The old ways had failed too many times. Perhaps new ways would serve better. Perhaps the orcs and the Horde had finally learned from their mistakes. The Shadowlands called when Sylvanas tore the veil between worlds. At the frozen throne in Icecrown, where the Lich King had once sat in terrible majesty, Sylvanas confronted Bolvar Fordragon, the paladins who had taken up the helm of domination after Arthas's death. Their battle was brief, but decisive. Sylvanas shattered the helm, and in doing so, tore open the barrier between the world of the living and the realm of death. The sky over Icecrown was replaced by a vision of Torghast, the Tower of the Damned, floating in the endless darkness of the Maw. The souls of the dead, which should have been sorted into the various afterlives of the Shadowlands according to their deeds in life, were being funneled directly into the Maw instead. Something had broken the machinery of death itself. Thrall, along with other leaders of both factions, was captured by the forces of the jailer and taken to Torghast. The tower was a place of unimaginable torment, an infinite prison where souls were broken through suffering and remade in service to dark powers. The jailer, Zoval, had been imprisoned there by the other Eternal Ones eons ago, but now he was free to enact whatever terrible plan he had been contemplating during his long imprisonment. The torments of Torghast were designed to break the will, to shatter the spirit, to reduce even the strongest soul to compliance. Thrall endured horrors that would have destroyed lesser beings, psychological tortures that forced him to relive his worst moments, physical agonies that seemed to have no end. But he had been forged in the fires of Durnholde Keep, had survived gladiatorial combat and wars against demons, had endured the loss of everyone he loved. The jailer's torments were terrible, but Thrall had known terrible things before. The imprisonment brought Thrall face to face with his past in unexpected ways. The Shadowlands were not a single afterlife, but many, different realms suited to different types of souls. Bastion was for the dutiful who would become angels. Ardenweald was for nature spirits who would be reborn. Maldraxxus was for warriors who would defend the cosmos. Revendreth was for the prideful who needed to atone for their sins. And the Maw was for those who could not or would not be redeemed. In this realm of death, Thrall encountered the soul of Draka, his mother who had died protecting him so many years ago. Draka had been judged by the Arbiter, the being who sorted souls into their proper afterlives, and sent to Maldraxxus, the realm of warriors. There she had risen through the ranks of the Necrolord houses, becoming a powerful figure in the eternal military that defended the Shadowlands. Their reunion was brief but profound, allowing Thrall to finally know the woman who had sacrificed everything for his chance at life. He also confronted Garrosh's fate. The former Warchief had been sent to Revendreth after his death, the realm where prideful souls were meant to face their sins and seek redemption. Garrosh had refused redemption, had clung to his pride and his hatred until he was cast into the maw as punishment for his intransigence. When Thrall encountered Garrosh in the maw, the conversation was not what anyone might have expected. Garrosh was broken, consumed by the torments of the darkest realm in the afterlife, but still defiant. He blamed Thrall for his fate, for making him Warchief when he was not ready, for killing him in what he still considered a dishonorable duel. Thrall's response was not anger, but something like acceptance. He acknowledged that he had made mistakes, that his decision to elevate Garrosh had been wrong, that his killing of the former Warchief had been tainted by the circumstances. But he also refused to accept all the blame. Garrosh had made his own choices, had committed his own sins, had refused every opportunity for redemption. In the end, Garrosh was destroyed entirely, his soul annihilated rather than continuing its eternal torment. It was not clear whether this was mercy or merely the final consequence of his refusal to change. The defeat of the jailer and the restoration of the Shadowlands brought Thrall back to the world of the living. He returned to his place on the Horde Council, to his family, to the life he had built from nothing over decades of struggle and sacrifice. Draka had told him something during their brief reunion, something that stayed with him, that she was proud of who he had become. She had died believing that her son would one day redeem their people, and she had been right. The baby she had hidden in the wilderness, the child she had expected to die, had grown into the leader of his people and had accomplished everything she had dreamed. Goal, the Redeemer. The name his parents had chosen was the name he had earned. The story of Thrall continues to unfold. He remains on the Horde Council, remains a father to his children, remains a shaman struggling to rebuild his connection to the elements that once flowed through him so naturally. The wounds from Garrosh's death have healed somewhat, though scars remain. But healing is possible, and Thrall has learned that even the deepest wounds can close with time and care. His daily life now is quieter than it once was. He spends time with Agra and their children, teaching them the shamanic traditions that he almost lost and has slowly regained. He attends council meetings, offers advice when asked, steps back when his input is not needed. It is a different role than the one he once played, but it is not a lesser one. Sometimes wisdom comes from knowing when not to act. The Horde Council has proven itself capable of governing without a single dominant leader. The representatives of each race debate and compromise, forge consensus where possible, and agree to disagree where necessary. There are still conflicts, still moments when the old hatreds threaten to resurface, but the structure holds. The orcs have learned finally that strength can come from unity rather than dominance. He has lived a life that spans the most dramatic era in orcish history. He was born into slavery and rose to lead his people. He was raised by humans who saw him as a weapon and became a bridge between human and orc, proving that peace was possible despite decades of war. He reunited with the spirits his people had lost, restored traditions that had been destroyed by demonic corruption, built a homeland from nothing in a harsh and unfamiliar land. The accomplishments are real and lasting. Orgrimmar stands as testimony to orcish determination, a city carved from stone and will. The shamanic traditions that Thrall restored are now taught to every young orc who shows aptitude, ensuring that future generations will never lose the connection that was so nearly destroyed. The alliances he forged with the Tauren and the Trolls have endured through multiple crises, proving that different peoples can find common ground. There were failures as well as successes. His choice of Garrosh as Warchief was a catastrophe that cost thousands of lives. His killing of Garrosh cost him his shamanic connection and the certainty that had guided him for so long. He could not save everyone he loved. Taretha, Doomhammer, Grom, Saurfang, Cairn. The weight of leadership carried a price that never stopped accumulating. Cairn's death was particularly painful. The old Tauren chieftain had been killed not by enemies, but by treachery within the Horde itself, poisoned during a Makgora with Garrosh through blades that had been secretly coated with a deadly substance. Thrall had not been there to prevent it, had been dealing with the cataclysm while Garrosh consolidated power. By the time he learned what had happened, Cairn was already buried, and his son Bane was struggling to hold the Tauren people together. Each death left its mark on Thrall. He carried them with him, the faces of those who had fallen because of his choices or his failures to act. Taretha, who had believed in him and died for that belief. Doomhammer, who had made him Warchief and fell at Durnholde. Grom, who had taught him Orcish tradition and died breaking the blood curse. Saurfang, who had called him back from retirement and died exposing Sylvanas. They were a gallery of ghosts that walked with him always. But against all of this, set against every failure and every loss, stands the simple fact of what Thrall achieved. When he escaped Durnholde Keep, the orcs were a broken people, prisoners waiting to die in camps that had become their world. They had no hope, no purpose, no connection to the spirits that had once guided them. They were waiting for extinction. Today, the orcs are free, proud, connected to their heritage, and building a future that earlier generations could not have imagined. They have cities and farms, warriors and shamans, children who grow up knowing nothing of chains or camps. They have allies among the Tauren and Trolls and goblins, peoples who chose to stand with them rather than against them. They have a place in the world, contested and challenged but real. Goel, son of Durotan and Draka, namesake of Redeemers, fulfilled his parents' hope. The baby they died protecting grew up to save his people, to restore their spirits, to lead them from slavery into freedom. Draka's final prayer was answered. Durotan's sacrifice was not in vain. The son they named Redeemer became one. Whatever else may be said of his life, that truth remains. The orcs endure because of what Thrall did. The Horde exists because he built it. The shamanic tradition lives because he restored it. The peace with the Alliance, fragile and often broken, exists at all because he proved it was possible. These are his legacy, more enduring than any title or any weapon. As you drift toward sleep tonight, consider the journey of Thrall. From chains to leadership, from slavery to shamanism, from the darkness of Durnholde Keep to the councils of nations, his path demonstrates that destiny is not fixed, that the circumstances of birth do not determine the meaning of life. Consider the moments that defined him. The infant hidden in the brush while his parents died defending him. The child growing up in captivity, learning to fight but never learning to surrender. The young orc escaping into the wilderness, hunting for a heritage that had been denied him. The shaman kneeling before the elements for the first time, feeling the connection that had been lost to his people for a generation. Consider the friendships that shaped him. Taretha, who saw a person where others saw a monster. Grom, Hellscream, who taught him what it meant to be an orc. Orgrim Doomhammer, who trusted him with the future of their people. Jaina Proudmoore, who proved that peace between enemies was possible. Cairn Bloodhoof, who offered wisdom when Thrall needed guidance. Vol'jin, who told him hard truths when flattery would have been easier. Sour Fang, who called him back to duty when retreat would have been simpler. Consider the choices that challenged him. To leave the Eastern Kingdoms when fighting would have been easier. To ally with humans and elves against demons when distrust ran deep. To accept the Forsaken into the Horde when fear and hatred counseled rejection. To step down as Warchief when the elements called him. To choose Garrosh as his successor when others urged caution. To kill Garrosh when mercy might have been wiser. Each choice carried consequences that rippled forward through time, shaping not just Thrall's life, but the lives of millions. Consider the burdens that weighed upon him, the responsibility for an entire people's future, the guilt over decisions that led to suffering and death, the grief of watching friends fall one by one, the shame of failures that could not be undone. Thrall carried these burdens because someone had to, because leadership meant accepting the weight that others could not bear. The elements still whisper in the winds of Durotar, still flow in the rivers, and burn in the forges of Orgrimmar. Shamans still teach the old ways to new generations, still maintain the connection that Thrall helped restore. The Horde still stands, imperfect and often troubled, but still united by the principles that Thrall established when he first led his people to Kalimdor. The spirits remember what was done and what was lost. They carry the memories of those who fell in the long journey from Draenor to the internment camps to Kalimdor and beyond. They honor the sacrifices of Durotan and Draka, of Taretha and Doomhammer, of Grom and Cairn and Saurfang. They whisper these names to those who listen, ensuring that the dead are not forgotten. Perhaps that is the greatest legacy of all, not what Thrall himself achieved, but what he made possible for those who came after. The children of the orcs, who were prisoners in the internment camps, grow up free, never knowing the chains that bound their parents. They learn shamanism as their birthright, connect with the elements as naturally as breathing, walk in a world that their grandparents could not have imagined. Those children tell stories of the Warchief who led their people to freedom, who stood against demons and dragons, who built a nation from nothing in the wilderness. They do not know all the details, do not understand all the costs, but they know that their lives are possible because of what one orc accomplished. They inherit his legacy without fully comprehending its weight. Goel made that world. The Redeemer redeemed. Someday, when Thrall passes from this world into whatever afterlife awaits, he will walk among the spirits he has served all his life. Perhaps he will find his parents there, finally meeting them as an adult, rather than as an infant too young to remember. Perhaps he will find Taretha and Grom, Doomhammer and Saurfang, all the friends who fell along the way. Perhaps they will tell him that he did well, that he was worthy of their sacrifices, that the world they helped create was worth the price they paid. Until that day, he continues, wiser now than when he was young, more patient, more willing to let others lead, still connected to the elements, though the connection is not what it once was, still devoted to his people, even when his role is quieter than before, still Goel, the Redeemer, the son of Durotan and Draka, the slave who became warchief, who became shaman, who became father and council member and keeper of memories. The story of Thrall is not finished yet, but this chapter, at least, draws to a close. Somewhere in Orgrimmar tonight, in the city that Thrall built from nothing, young orcs are sleeping soundly in beds that their grandparents never knew. They dream of adventures and glory, not of chains and cages. They wake to a world where shamans teach the old ways and warriors train for battles that are fought by choice rather than desperation. And somewhere among them, perhaps, is a child who will grow up to lead their people through challenges that we cannot yet imagine. Perhaps that child will be inspired by the stories of Thrall, will learn from his triumphs and his failures, will carry forward the legacy that began with a baby hidden in the Alterac Mountains so many years ago. That is what redemption truly means. Not just saving oneself, but creating the conditions for others to thrive. Not just breaking free, but building a world where freedom is possible for everyone. Thrall did that. Goal did that. The Redeemer redeemed. Let this tale fade now into the gentle darkness of approaching sleep. May you find in your dreams the same courage that Thrall found in his darkest moments, the same determination to break free of whatever chains may bind you. The spirits of earth and air, fire and water watch over all who sleep beneath the stars. Thank you for joining us here at World of Sleepcraft. If you enjoyed this journey through the life of Azeroth's most legendary warchief, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating these tales of Azeroth for your peaceful nights. Every like and subscription helps bring more stories to those who seek peaceful slumber. Until next time, may your rest be deep and your dreams be free of chains. May the spirits guide you through the night and greet you gently when morning comes. Sleep well, champion. May the elements watch over you, and may your dreams carry you to places of peace and wonder. Rest now, for tomorrow brings new adventures, new stories, and new chances to become something greater than you were before. Sleep well.